So we're going to take a look at some concepts that are pretty key to Chapter 3. So Chapter 3 is a bit of a bear in the sense that pretty much all the essential foundational skills that you need to know about programming are pretty much introduced here in Chapter 3. So you can see that Andy Harris starts out with introducing the idea of variables. What is a variable? Which is basically a way to store information so that we can refer back to it or change it or update it or keep track of some value. A condition is basically some kind of check to see if something is true or false. We can also have parts of our program that are used based off these conditions. And then we have the idea of a loop, which is basically some process that is repeated until some value is true or false. We'll have the data structure of an array and then a function. Now, we've already sort of seen functions, but now we're going to be providing a little bit more clarity on what a function is all about. So what I'm going to do to try to condense introducing these ideas, but you should be reading this chapter, read everything in this chapter, but something I'm going to do to try to condense introducing these ideas is to walk through an example program. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a program that uses JavaScript inside HTML to check to see what a grade would be for a student. So like if a student enters, say, a 65, then it would display a letter grade of a D. Or if a student enters 93, it would display a letter grade of an A. So I'm going to walk through how to do some of that here today. So what I want to do is start off with opening up Skeleton. So you should already have access to the Skeleton file. So here I've saved my code inside another folder. So this is just what I'm doing on my home computer. You could certainly do something similar and store all your files in a folder. It's typically also advised that you store every project in its own folder as well. But I'm just making a file, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Skeleton, but I'm going to copy Skeleton and I'm going to paste it immediately. Now what I'm really going to do is I'm going to build this file called DetermineGrade, but I already have that, so I'm going to make another example and I'm just going to call this DetermineGrade2. So just to, I don't want to confuse you. So since I have this file, it's basically Skeleton right now is all it is, just renamed something else. I'm going to right click this file. I'm going to edit with Notepad++. So if you have some other text editor, brackets, or something else, you could use that instead, but my preference is to go with Notepad++. So as we already know, this is a basic HTML file, and what I want to do immediately is I want to start to build a little bit of HTML code. So inside the body, I'm going to create a form, and I'm going to immediately close that form, and inside the form I'm going to add a label which is going to say test score, and I'm going to close the label. And then I'm going to have an input which is of type text, and I'm going to give it an ID, and I'm going to call it txt_num. Yeah, that should be fine. And finish out my input. So input itself is it is itself content. And then I'm going to do 2 break tags at the end of that just for good measure, just so when this displays it will go down to the next line. And then I close the form, and then well, I could put, I think I'll put the button inside the form. That probably would be better. And what's going to happen is when the user clicks this, it's going to launch a function called getGrade. which I'm going to build here in a few moments. And the button itself is going to say get letter grade. And then I'm going to close the button. Now, outside the form, but still inside body, I'm going to have a div, which I'm going to give an ID of, I'll just call it output. And right now, it'll just say the word empty, just to demonstrate that that's going to change. So when the user clicks the button, it says get letter grade, it's going to find a function called get grade. I'm going to save this. I'm going to launch it in the browser, and right now what I see is essentially this, and you can see that there's not a lot going on here. Nothing's going to happen right now anyway. So I'm going to go back to Notepad++, and I'm going to start to build my JavaScript code. So we know that JavaScript is inside a tag called script, which by default will be understood and assumed that it is JavaScript. And inside here, I'm going to create two variables. I want a variable that I'm going to call text num1, and then I want to create another variable that I call output. Now notice, this is really important, notice that these two variables are not inside a function. They are not inside a function. Alright, so I'm going to create another, I'm going to create not another, but I'm going to create a function, and what I want to do with this function is it's going to be called getGrade, and what I want it to do is I want it to check to see what is stored in a variable called grade. Basically, I want to check to see what the user put in here, and then I want to determine if it should display an A, a B, a C, D, or E, or a failing grade. So text num is really going to be associated with this guy, and then that's going to point to something else. So really what I want to do is I actually want another function that's going to assign these and kind of set these up. So I'm going to create another function called init, short for initialization, and that function, all it's going to do is it's going to assign text num1. It's going to basically kind of attach it or associate it with the element by ID of this thing. So I'm going to associate it with that ID. And this is the end of the statement, so I need a semicolon. And then I'm also going to associate output by ID. Whoops, not what I meant to do. And I'm going to associate that with an ID called output. Now be aware that this is not the same thing as this. They have the same name. I could rename these. That's a little bit ambiguous, or ambiguous, I should say. Sorry, I made up my own word. Ambiguous. That's a little bit confusing, but just because that's the convention you'll see Andy Harris do. So now inside getGrade, I need a variable which I'm going to call grade, and it is going to pull in what is stored in this. And I want it to store the value that's in there. Now just be aware there's going to be a problem with this, which I'm going to come back to here in a little bit. And what I want to do is I want to check to see if this value, I want to check to see what it is. Now before I do that, I'm going to do a console.log, and I'll explain what this is. And this is going to just display what the user entered. And all I'm doing is I'm just building output here. So this is all this is really going to do right now is when the user clicks on get grade, it's going to display in this thing called console log, which I'll show you where that is. It's going to display you entered and then the number that they entered. So I'm going to save this, go back to the browser, I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to enter, say, I don't know, 87. So I enter the number 87, I click get letter grade, nothing happens. Well, that's because console log is displaying inside the console. The console is not in here. The console is a tool that is available using the Web Developer Toolbar. Now I'm using Google Chrome, which I suggest that you use. And Google Chrome has a tool called the Web Developer Toolbar, which, if you click these three little dots, I believe it's under More Tools and Developer Tools. You can see you can also open it with Control-Shift-I, and you can also open it, I believe, with, I don't want to say the wrong thing here, Control F11? No, that's not that. F12? Yes, F12. Couldn't remember. So there's several ways to open this. And you'll notice that when this opens, we have these tabs here. It's the Elements, Console, Sources, Network. I want to go to Console. And now really what I'm seeing here, this is the console. That console is going to log information to